Hello and welcome to our fifth podcast episode of a brand new series called The Waterloo Advantage. I am Dhwani Patel, one of your hosts, a third-year software engineering student, and co-hosting with me is Varun Kundra, a third-year math student. Today we have our fifth very special guest, David Gu, who will be talking about his co-op experiences and much more. So welcome, David. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Hi, Donvi. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I am David Gu, as you said, and I was previously a second-year software engineering student, but I'm working on a startup now, so I'm not sure how that designation applies to me. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about my co-ops and other experiences.
All right.
Nice.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So you said that you were previously a second-year software engineering student. So does that mean you're not doing school right now? Like, are you working full-time on your startup?
Yeah, currently I'm working full-time, which is why you may have seen that I've disappeared from the SE events and related stuff. So I've been working full-time for a little bit more than a year now on my startup. And before that, I was in my 2A term of software engineering.
Right. So just before we get to your startup, I do just want to talk about the one co-op you did have before your 2A. If I'm correct, you looked at Wish. So can you just tell us a bit about like what Wish does and what your role there was?
Yeah, definitely. So Wish is it is an online shopping app. They've got an app on your phone, they've got a website, and you can buy things. And my role there was I was working on their Android app, and I was also working on the server as sort of this Android full stack type role. And honestly, Wish is great. It's a cool bunch of people. Everyone on my team and everyone I interacted with there was super nice, and they're all super helpful. So if anyone's listening, well, it's a great place to work. You should go check them out on Waterloo Works or wherever else you find jobs.
Right. Okay. And so I guess let's move straight into your startup. Like tell me about the thought process of after 2A ended, it's like January 2020, or how did you make the choice to start your startup and leave school?
Yeah. So, well, to give background on it, starting a startup is something that I had wanted to do for some time. It was sort of the motivation for me to do software engineering, actually. Coming out of high school, I was sort of choosing between doing software engineering at Waterloo and doing engineering science at U of T. And the reason that I chose software engineering was because, based off of what I heard, it was a lot more of a practical type of degree. You'd learn a lot more hands-on stuff, and that seemed like the better choice if I wanted to, I guess, develop my skills to a point where I could start a startup. So that was something that I've been thinking about for some time. And around the January mark of 2020, I got admitted to the YC Winter 20 batch, and that was sort of a big enough deal that it wasn't hard for me to make the decision to sort of leave school and commit to that. So that's sort of what happened in that moment.
Right. And I've talked to Eric Lee, and I understand he was your co-founder initially, and you guys had a completely different product idea back then.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Eric's a cool guy. And originally I was working with him on a documentation product called HyperDoc, and that didn't work out for a variety of reasons. And I guess after that, I had a decision about whether to continue working on another idea which I had or return to school. I think Eric returned to school, and I decided to work on a different idea, which turned into Perfect Recall. And yeah, I can talk more about the original thing and why that didn't work out, or I can talk about the new thing. What are you guys curious about?
Oh, it's up to you. Like we'd love to hear both things. But maybe you can start off with your YC experience, like
Mhm.
because it seems like maybe that was pivotal in you. Like, did it have an influence in you switching your idea, or like just like tell us about that experience of doing YC and going through their program.
Yeah, sure. YC is really cool. We were sort of an interesting batch because we were there right as COVID was becoming a thing. So sort of at the beginning of the batch, I just saw this news about this sort of weird disease coming out of China. And like at that point, it was sort of like not a big deal. It was like, okay, like these things happen. It's gonna be like I don't know. At worst, it's gonna be like Ebola. Like we're gonna hear about it on the news, and it's gonna be a horrible tragedy. Um, and then about 2 months later, we actually had to sort of evacuate. Like we booked a flight for like 2 days later, and we just like got up and left. And the reason for that was this was around February. When things were really getting into full swing and no one knew if the world would end or not. Like the toilet paper was flying off the shelves and all that. And we weren't sure if they'd close the borders and we'd have to like trek to Vancouver to like cross the land border or something ridiculous. So we booked a flight and we sort of just got out of there really fast. But in terms of non-COVID stuff, I think the really cool thing about YC is that you meet a lot of people who you typically wouldn't get to interact with as maybe a student or as a co-op at a company. You have people with lots of experience and people with lots of interesting experience. Like a bit of background on how it works. The people who sort of advise you and the people who sort of admit you, those are the same people, but they're the YC partners. And those are basically people who've done a startup before and had some degree of success. And oftentimes it's a pretty large degree of success. So you have some like pretty well-known people like the CEO of Twitch.tv and stuff. And it's an interesting experience because you meet these people and it's almost like they're larger than life. Like you hear about them, but it's really helpful because well, they have good advice. They've sort of been through it. They have maybe practical answers to some of the questions that you have. And B, it also sort of gives you a sense of perspective. It's like, I mean, they didn't start out as the CEO of some massive company that got acquired by Amazon. They started out as like a regular startup founder, like everyone else in this room. And it sort of gives you a perspective that you are also capable of doing this thing. Like it's not like they were born as like superhumans. And I think that something that people do say a lot, and I think is also true, is that doing a startup is a big growth experience. Like you learn a lot of stuff on the way, and the learning along the way is sort of what I guess gives you the capability to deal with the challenges that you run into. It's like it's something that's hard to prepare for in other ways, I guess. It's not like you can train for it. It's like you have to do it. So that's sort of a little bit of a rambly description of why I thought YC was nice. But
No, it's good. That definitely makes a lot of sense. And like, we've heard a lot of things about like people like similar things from people coming out of YC, and it's good to know. It's good to hear that from you as well. Could you tell us like how you met your co-founder? Was it through YC or did you meet him through school?
Oh yeah, so I knew Eric for some time. I actually met him when I was in high school, I think, at this like programming contests like class thing in Toronto. And yeah, that was sort of like weird. It's sort of like a small world thing because he ended up at Waterloo. I also ended up at Waterloo. So I don't know, you meet people in all kinds of ways. And
Right.
I'm not sure there's too much of a story there. So
Fair enough.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. So let's talk about your pivot, because I know a lot of startups pivot, and especially during something like COVID, it makes sense to probably for a lot of startups. But like, how was that process for you? Was it? I imagine it would be difficult. Is that what it was like?
yeah, pivoting sucks, and it sucks because it sucks for two reasons, I think. It sucks for one reason because it seems like a big decision, and it seems like a big important decision, like what you're going to work on, and it's stressful because it's not something that you sort of make progress on in small steps. Like you can try a bunch of things out, but if they don't work, you're back at square one. It's not like, okay, you're trying to get more customers. Like today you get 10, tomorrow you get 15. Like in total you have 25. It's like maybe you have this list of things that you want to try out, and some of them work and some of them don't. And you maybe have a time limit because you've got to figure out something like before your funding runs out or before whenever. But it's just a stressful experience, and it's something that you don't want to be doing. But it's also exciting in a way because now you don't have any sort of restrictions on what you can work on. You get to pick something which you would want to work on instead of something that you have to work on. So it's sort of like a freedom as well. But I'm glad that that's over.
Can you tell us about Perfect Recall? Like, what is Perfect Recall? What do you guys do?
Cool, yeah. So Perfect Recall records your Zoom calls and lets you take notes during the call and share clips from your calls afterwards. And people who use Perfect Recall are people like product managers, people like user researchers who do interviews with their company's customers, and then they have to come up with recommendations. It's helpful to share clips of somebody saying in their own words that they don't like a feature or they really like a feature. And yeah, it's a tool to help people communicate. People who are on video calls all the time, which is now most of us.
Are there any because I think you mentioned Zoom specifically, but do you guys support other platforms, or are you planning to support other platforms like Google Meet? Like, if we wanted to clip something from this podcast, could we use Perfect Recall maybe sometime in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So support for other call platforms is definitely something that's on our list of things to do. There's I guess it's sort of one of those default things. It's like you always want to support more call platforms, but it's definitely something that we're working on. And since you guys do use Google Meet, when we do support Google Meet, I will send you a message and I'll let you know.
Yeah, that'll be much appreciated, David. I also wanted to talk about the launch strategy. Like, how did you approach that? How did you, grow this startup to focus on this specific app? All of that, especially during COVID.
Yeah, so in terms of launching, there's a bunch of different places you can launch. There's stuff like Product Hunt, which is, if you guys who are listening don't know what Product Hunt is, it's basically a website where people post their new products. That's pretty good. There's other posts. There's other places you can post. You can post on stuff like Reddit. You can post on Hacker News. I think in general, people focus a lot on sort of launching their product and making sure that I guess people focus on like big bang type launches where it's like they want to make something that's very, very perfect and then just send it out to the whole world at once. And
Right.
something that happens more often than not is it turns out the world doesn't care. And at least in my opinion, a better strategy for sort of getting your product out there is get some people to use it. Like if you're solving a problem that your friends have, like if you can get like 20 of your friends to use it on a regular basis, like more than once per week, that's a much more solid start than if you have nobody using it and you feel like people are going to like it a lot, because I think people's behavior is a little bit unpredictable. And a lot of problems you discover sort of once people are trying to use it. I'm trying to think of sort of what a good analogy would be for this. I'm not quite sure. I guess the general principle is that it's really hard to predict from first principles what's going to be good and what's not going to be good. And the analogy would be then it's sort of science, not math. You have to have some sort of experimental evidence from which to draw your conclusions from. It's not something you can derive or prove.
Right.
It's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
And so it's been a year now, if I'm correct, right? You launched in beginning of 2020. So how has growth been, and how have things changed over the course of the year? Obviously, COVID, I'm guessing, would have helped you a lot because more and more people came online and started using these platforms. But could you just talk a bit more about how the year has gone so far?
Yeah, it's been good. At least at the moment, we can't share too much specific data about traction, just because of sort of the stage we're at. We have sort of fundraising coming up in the future, and I guess generally around events like that, it's recommended not to publicly disclose too much. But it's going well. It's going very well.
Right.
COVID has definitely helped. People have shifted significantly towards Zoom calls and remote-based stuff. Like people, like for example, user researchers previously, they would bring people into their headquarters, and they might have like an in-person interview. They might have like a video team that actually like sets up cameras and stuff to record these people. And I think that's something people have been discovering, is that Zoom calls are basically just as good, and you don't have to bring people to your office, and people don't like being brought to your office because it takes their time. And I think something that was cool and nice about the shift to, I guess, remote work is that previously there was a lot of resistance to trying out things like doing stuff over remote, or instead of having people come in to interview them in person, you interview them over Zoom call, because the consensus was sort of like, well, it's not going to be as good. They're not going to be as engaged. We're not going to get as good data. Like, why would we sort of do something that might mess this up if we don't have to, if we have the option not to? And I think that now, because everything has to be remote, and people have to try it out, people are discovering that, hey, actually, it's not that bad. And maybe the advantages actually outweigh the problems which we expected to have, but didn't actually happen. So.
Right. And so, like, I think you mentioned this, Twain, that user researchers seem like one of your like big users of Perfect Recall. Are there other like users that like archetypes that really stand out that this is like really, really good for? Because for example, as a student, you might have Zoom classes, and you take notes there. But are there like sort of other users you see this being Perfect Recall being really good for and really helping?
Yeah. Like apart from user researchers I mentioned earlier, people like product managers, we've sort of thought about students, but we haven't really gone in that direction too much. Students are an interesting market because students typically don't like paying for things. I guess people in general don't like paying for things, but when your company pays for it, it's a lot easier to.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Makes sense.
No, it's true.
So that's not something that we've looked at yet, but I guess that's something we would be looking at in the future as well. Yeah, students are an interesting market. That's something that that we learned. I guess yeah. That's all I have to say for that.
Right. No, that's fine. And again, like, feel free to, like, answer any question as you like. But so, because you mentioned pricing, how, like, can you tell us a bit more about, like, the process of determining, like, the price of your of your product? Like, are there certain surprising things you learned when you were saying the price? Like, I feel like most people, I've heard from some founders that before they started a startup, they didn't, like, see pricing in the right way, and then once they actually did the startup and started talking to users and getting paid users, they got a whole new perspective on, like, how to price a product. So maybe, what about Perfect Recall? Like, did you learn anything from pricing your product? Like, what was that process like?
Pricing is interesting. You don't really know ahead of time what a good price for your product would be. You can look at competitive products to sort of get a baseline. I guess generally what people recommend is you just pick a price and then you keep raising it. And then once people complain, then you sort of know what's too high.
Sort of like the willingness to pay approach.
Yeah, because in general, it's like, again, it's hard to determine ahead of time unless you're in some very specific product categories. Maybe there's standards for pricing, like stuff like cloud computing. People look at AWS. But then you have examples like Heroku, which charge a ridiculous amount of money. Yeah, in terms of pricing, it's sort of just see what people pay you. I guess a piece of advice I have is don't be embarrassed asking people for money. Like, that's something that that comes up, and that's something that I feel like I felt a little bit at the beginning, where it's like, if you haven't sold anything before, it's sort of a weird experience, like asking people to put their card in this form. It's a little bit odd, but just get over it quickly, and yeah, pricing is another one of those things, which is science, not math. Just try it and see what happens.
Right. And, like, I understand most of your customers are, like, enterprise clients. So, like, do you think that the pricing would be different with consumers, or do you think that's also a similar approach for, like, direct to consumer businesses?
Dude, selling to big companies is interesting. Because in big companies, and this is also, like, when you do a startup, you learn a lot of things that you otherwise wouldn't encounter, I guess, as an intern, or maybe even as a full-time software engineer. Because, like, companies who buy software at a certain size, the person who pays for the software is very far removed from the person who makes the decision to buy the software, who is very far removed from the person who actually uses the software. So yeah, there's been books written about how to sell products to enterprises. They are interesting. They have sort of their own internal stuff going on. Like one thing that's interesting is, like, some companies like annual pricing, even if you don't give them a discount for annual pricing, just because, like, every time they pay for something, they have to go through someone, and going through someone once per month is a pain in the butt. So there's lots of weird details like that you don't expect. I guess that's what I have to say about selling to larger companies. They're kind of weird. They're not like a person with a credit card.
Right.
And then you just brought this up as well, but maybe you could expand on that a bit more, like working at your co-op as an intern versus working at a startup. Like, what are some of those, like, notable differences? Like, one I think that really stands out so far is that, like, it seems like startup, there's a lot of things that go on that you learn on the way of doing it, and you learn are actually science instead of math. But there's, other differences you can, tell listeners about like doing a co-op that most of our listeners are probably doing versus like a startup.
Yeah, definitely. I think I have sort of two things to say. The first thing is that at a co-op, at an internship, you're sort of insulated from a lot of what goes into shipping a piece of software. For example, at Wish, I was on the Android team, and I would write Android code, and I'd write Python, and then it would go into our issue tracker, and then at the end of the week or whatever the release cycle is, it would just disappear somewhere. It would get whisked off to be massaged into an app form. And sort of my responsibility ended once the code passed code review. And I sort of had no idea what would go on after that. And at a startup, if you are setting up all of this stuff yourself, you do have to care. And you, I think you do learn a lot more than you would at a internship for a comparable amount of time. And sort of something I remember actually is, so people sometimes they'll do like a variety of different internships because they want to see what role they like the best. Like they might do like a DevOps internship, they might do front end, they might do back end. At a startup, you have to do all of them. And you also have to do sales and customer support, which is sort of adjacent roles. But I do think you get a much better idea of how the different parts of a company fit together. Like at Wish, we had a lot of business intelligence people. And I remember thinking, like, what the hell do these people do? Like we had to like write like analytic stuff to give them events to analyze. And I was like, what are these people even doing? And I think after doing a startup, I guess in general, I have a better idea of what the different roles of people are doing and why they're necessary. And
right.
And I guess one other thing is just doing a startup in general, you'll learn a lot more about, and this is something I mentioned earlier, but like the whole process of shipping out a product or a piece of code. Like I had to, actually pretty recently, I had to deal with some AWS infrastructure stuff. And there's a lot of stuff which sort of as an intern, you don't encounter. Like I was setting up our infrastructure on AWS with Terraform and had to do a deep dive into network security stuff because it turns out that when you have virtual machines or instances sitting in a network, you have to do a lot of things to keep hackers from getting at them. And
right.
well, there's a whole bunch of stuff involving network rules, routing tables, what's the difference between the different types of subnets you might have in your VPC. And I guess in general, as an intern or as a full-time software engineer, stuff is already set up for you. You can sort of just focus on what your core job description is, which is writing whatever code the product managers tell you to do. But at a startup, you sort of have to set everything up yourself. And yeah, I think that's, I don't know if that answers your question or not. I don't even know what the question was. But
No, definitely it does. Like, no, it was good. Like you get some very specific examples of the differences between a co-op and a startup, which are, I think, very helpful for people who are looking to do a startup but haven't done one
yeah
yet.
Like it sounds like there's a lot of context switching going on, and I know personally, like I find that difficult to do, and focusing is much easier, but perhaps at a startup you can't always do that, right?
Yeah, so the context switching is definitely rough. I guess some things that you can do to help is you can sort of allocate blocks of time to do different things. Like if I'm writing some large amount of application code, I might just dedicate a whole day to it and not do anything else during that day. Because in general, I feel like I'm a lot more efficient if I'm doing one thing for an extended period of time. And a lot of things are sort of like, you can set them up and you don't have to worry about them anymore, like your build system. If you have like a proper CI thing going, hopefully you don't need to touch it too much. You don't need to mess with your infrastructure too much once you've got everything set up. If it's causing you problems, well, that's that's something you did wrong. Like, I think one thing, like I guess one other sort of startup-y thing is that you've really got to optimize for what will allow you to do the most with the least resources. Like, automating stuff, making stuff simple, and I don't think simple is the right word. I think automatic is the right word. If something doesn't need like your manual input, it saves you the context switching basically. So, and this is sort of like a random topic, I guess, but stuff like having CI, having stuff like your tests automatically run, having stuff like alerting setup, like, I guess this is another difference between being an intern and working at a startup, or especially your own startup, where it's like, as an intern, you sort of have, I think, less ownership over the result of the code. Like if your code has a bug, well, I guess like maybe your manager is not going to give you that outstanding that you want, but I don't know, like you're still going to get paid. But when you're shipping code for a product which is sort of your company's, it's a lot more stressful. There's a lot more having dreams of your servers going down, and I think just things that you can do to reduce that stress is helpful, and it saves you sort of that context switching and worrying about unrelated things all the time.
Right. So, like, like you mentioned, like doing a lot of things with very few resources. Does having a co-founder really help there, or like what are your thoughts on like bringing other people into your team or hiring in general? Like, does that help a startup in your opinion, or do you find like it's better to keep the
Yeah, so I actually do have a co-founder, and she is great. So my co-founder is Amanda, and she does most of the well, basically all of the design and visual stuff. She does a lot of the front end stuff too. I can't make a website that looks like the one we currently have. My skills are not that developed.
It looks really nice right now, by the way.
Thanks.
Checked out your website.
And I think something that's important in hiring and having people join your team, like having a co-founder, it's important that your skills are complementary. Like, I don't know if you've ever read the book, like The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks. It's like sort of this classic software engineering book. And it's actually kind of a fun read, because this guy, he was writing like an operating system in assembly. It was like way back in the day before like C was even a thing.
Okay.
And
okay.
Yeah, it's a really fun read. It's sort of like a mini history lesson, but something that he talks about is that there's a communication overhead, and there is a work sort of partitioning overhead, or like a concurrency overhead. Like, have you heard of Amdahl's law? Like, I don't know if
I think I've heard about
yeah, it's like when like adding, like there's a limit to how concurrent your work can be. And at a certain level, the overhead of communication and synchronization reduces your efficiency. And that's sort of like the key point in the Mythical Man month, it's like the best way to make a software project later is to add more people to it if it's already late. I think something that's
Right. Interesting.
valuable at a startup is that if you have a relatively small group of people who are very committed to the project, you can sort of do away with a lot of inefficiencies. Like at a larger company, if you're worried about turnover, you have to have sort of overlapping understanding of the code. Like you need to know what's going on in this module that your coworker wrote, because if he leaves, you don't want the whole company to be hosed. And once you have more people, you're sort of dividing things into like individual tasks. Like at Wish, for example, I would be implementing like a single screen on the shopping, like the item feed, like a single specialized type of screen on the item feed. And I wouldn't have any context as to why the item feed was designed like that, the performance characteristics of the server which load the items. For example, like should we be caching the list of items, or is it okay to do a full refresh every single time you do some sort of action? And well, I'd have to ask people. And at least, like, I don't know if this is rambling a bit, but I feel like at a at a startup, your output will be much higher than at a I guess at a co-op or some other company, just because you have sort of the full context of the area of the software that you're working on, and that makes you much faster. So that was sort of like a rambling answer to the whole like, should you hire more people thing. But like I guess the TLDR is hiring more people can help, but you have to have a very good idea of what they're going to be working on and how what they're working on is going to relate to the rest of the product as a whole. So.
Right. Okay, I was just wondering, like, what would Perfect Recall look like ideally, let's say 5 years from now, in your mind?
Well, like, ideally, everyone would be using it who's on a Zoom call.
Right.
Wait, so I'm sorry, just to cut you off. Like, if I did, you want everyone using it on Zoom, but is there like any direction of like also getting acquired by Zoom or some other video calling software companies? Because if it's acquired by Zoom, then everybody would be default.
At least for me, that's not something that I feel like I need to worry about right now. Sort of the best way to have a good outcome is to just focus on making your product something that lots of people use and lots of people love. So that's my perspective, at least. I'm not going to put too much thought into who might buy Perfect Recall or anything like that.
Okay. I sort of want to move away from Perfect Recall and just talk a bit more about you. I remember I remember our conversations in first year mostly. I think you were really interested in virtual reality, and a few other technologies. But what are sort of the technologies you're interested in right now, or maybe not technologies, but problem spaces you're really interested in? And speak a bit more about.
So, well, problem spaces specifically would be, well, like. You're like moving away from Perfect Recall, but I guess I'm interested in the thing that I'm currently working on. I'm interested in how people take notes and also share information from calls that they do. In terms of sort of just technical stuff, I'm interested in, well, something that's been sort of like annoying is observability in web applications or in server-side applications. For example, if you have some sort of bug, if you're testing something locally, you know what inputs you're putting into the function and you know what is expected to come out of it. Something that is a bit difficult right now, I feel like with web technologies in general and server-side technologies in general, is having a clear idea of what data is going through your system without putting a lot of effort into instrumentation. Like, for example, I think lots of people are working on this, but for example, if you have a web server and you have a whole bunch of endpoints, and maybe some of them are GraphQL endpoints, which is a whole other story in terms of complexity, and you want to see
Right.
what is taking the most time and on what kinds of data. There's no, well, at least I haven't heard of any, I guess, like well supported default ways to sort of drop some sort of logger in and have a good idea of, okay, what are the top like 10% of slow responses that you're getting? Is there any sort of pattern on what kind of data? Is it, for example, you have a function whose runtime scales with the amount of items passed into it, and your heaviest users have a lot of items they're passing into this function, and it's giving them a bad experience. I guess like something that I'm interested in is how do you collect performance data in a way that gives you sort of actionable results without waiting for people to tell you that it's slow? Because that's just a general thing that's been kind of annoying. But
have you faced that question at Perfect Recall?
Yeah. So sort of where that comes from is early on we had some actually client-side performance problems, and we fixed those. It was sort of a annoying problem with, I don't know if you've worked on React, but it's like React contexts. When anything changes in a React context, the whole subtree re-renders, and there was like, it was just like trying to store a lot of data client side and update it in a way that only the affected components were updated. But without going too much into that, the way that we actually found out that was sort of a problem was someone told us, and someone was like when I do this thing, it's really slow. And we put some time into investigating it. We found it. We fixed the bug. But I guess on the React side, you have sort of the ability to like open up your React debugger and do this action and see, okay, these are the renders that took this amount of time. But at least like for an API endpoint or for some asynchronous task, it's a lot harder to do that because they won't be triggered by user input. They'll be triggered by maybe something that your front end does. Maybe it's a scheduled task that runs at some point during the day. It's a lot harder to set up test scenarios to see what will happen using, I guess, data that would be produced by someone using the application in like a real way. I guess just monitoring is time consuming, and that's sort of a tangent.
Right. Going back to the other problem you mentioned, which is taking notes during video calls. Are there like other things that like really excite you or interest you in that space besides like what of course you guys have built Perfect Recall because it excited you and you saw it as something that you'd want yourself as well. But are there other things that you've seen that are also interesting for doing that?
Could you repeat your question?
Just more like I'm trying to like expand a bit more about the problem space of taking notes while being on a video call. Are there other things besides obviously Perfect Recall because you built it that you've seen that have been sort of useful or exciting in that space? Like maybe it's not your product, or it's just like an existing workflow that you saw was really painful, or to the contrary, like it was really cool that they were doing it that certain way without using your tool. or like, is there like nothing out there that like really helps you do
I feel
that?
like in general, people's
recall is the thing.
sort of video note-taking workflows are kind of messed up. Like you have people who just record their screen and then go over it with iMovie afterwards and sort of chop
That
out some
sounds terrible.
sections, which is not fantastic. Something that people do sort of in general is to just take text notes, like they just type very, very fast. And it either comes out as sort of a direct transcript or it comes out incomprehensible. And I guess in general, like this is an area where people have not developed super great workflows and people are sort of just living with it. And I guess that's sort of part of where the opportunity comes from for something like Perfect Recall.
Yeah, I think just to sort of modify Vani's question a little bit, like, are there other products that inspired you in this space, or are there other products that you'd want someone to make, but you don't have time to make, something like that?
Well, like the thing I was talking about earlier with observability and my web server, that's something I want someone to make. I want to never worry about sort of monitoring and setting up alerts again, because that's something that keeps me up at night. I'm like something could be going totally wrong and nobody's gonna call me on my phone. But at least in this space, we're sort of working on what we want. So there's nothing really specific that I'm like, in this space I'd want someone else to build.
Right, fair enough.
I think we're like nearing the end here, so I was only gonna ask like a few more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Another question is like, where do you get your conviction behind ideas that you choose to work on? Because I feel like like you've gone through a year of executing on a specific product and idea, and you had worked on one previously as well and pivoted. But I feel like especially students at Waterloo, like they talk a lot about this like ideas or side quote unquote side projects. And one common thing I've noticed is a lot of people, when I ask them, why don't you go full time into this, or don't treat this as a side project and take it more seriously. I've heard lack of conviction is a big common reason. Maybe what gives you conviction to work on the ideas that you choose to work on?
I guess there's sort of two things in answering this question. The first part is that conviction is something that you can either develop or you can sort of go into it already having. I think for lots of people who might be listening who are current students, conviction will be something that they have to develop. And the reason for that is if you're going into a problem space with very strong conviction, it's probably because you've worked extensively in dealing with that problem before. And you have sort of, from your years of experience, developed a very good understanding of why this thing is broken and why your solution will be an effective one. And sort of developing conviction is sort of the same thing as option A, except that you start out without a very strong idea of what the problem space is, and by working on it, you develop that experience and understanding of what is broken and how your solution fixes it. So I think part of developing conviction in some sort of problem is just being willing to like go for it. At least as like, if you're a Waterloo student and you're sort of thinking about doing a startup, your opportunity cost really isn't that high. Like 4 months or 1 term is long enough to get somewhat enough of an idea about how real this problem is and how good your solution is. And again, it's a sort of science, not math thing. Like you have to try it to A, develop that experience, and B, actually have a good result on, or a good read on whether or not this is something that's real or good or not. So, and And to answer the second part of your question, I think where my conviction comes from is just I've worked on this and I've talked to people who experience this problem, and I have talked to our current users who use our product and have their problem solved, and that informs me about if what I'm doing is working or not.
Yeah. You mentioned the Mythical Man Month. I was wondering, do you have any other book recommendations, or what are you reading these days?
Mythical Man Month is good. The general sort of topic, I guess, to give people an overview of it, it's generally a book on software engineering, which is just how do you ship software that's correct and works and is shipped on time. And if you've ever worked on a big software project and you read that book, you'll be like, oh my God, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about. Other books that are good, there's a book on talking to potential users called The Mom Test, and it's really good. It sort of goes into how do you present your product in such a way that even your mom can't lie to you and tell you that it's good. And that's where the title comes from. Based off your reactions, I assume you've heard of it.
Yeah, we've had a podcast guest recommended before too.
Yeah, it's a good book, and it'll save you a lot of mistakes if you read it early on. So I recommend you do that. I can't think of any other good recommendations off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are lots of good books out there. But yeah, those two are two that I've been thinking about recently, at least.
Okay. And just to close it off, we usually ask this to all of our listeners, all of our guests at the very end. And like this question, there's like, two ways to see the question. So you can take whichever side you like. So one side of it is like, what advice would you have for listeners, which are, you are the students, or what's the best piece of advice you've received? And so you can choose to answer in either way.
I think the best piece of advice, I guess an answer to both of those questions would be sort of like just try it. It's sort of the best piece of advice I received, because I feel like previously I had sort of a bad tendency to spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not something would work, and sort of like theoretically, does this sound like a good idea or not? But what ends up happening is the amount of time that you would quote unquote waste trying out an idea that doesn't pan out is not super high if you sort of are smart about it. Like you make something that's small and self-contained and gives you a good answer. And also you learn stuff along the way. And the stuff you learn along the way is what actually points you towards what the correct solution is. And I think in general, something that people should just do is just try it. If it doesn't work out, your opportunity cost is limited, and you'll probably learn something as well. So
yeah, I think that aligns very well with what you've been saying about experimentation, the science, not math part of it. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, David. Thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure to learn more about Perfect Recall and all your insights in this domain. So this has been an amazing episode with another brilliant mind from our very own University of Waterloo. That's it, folks. See you next time with another episode on the Waterloo Advantage.